Thank you to USC for the invitation. Thank you to everybody involved in making my visit possible. So it's nice to visit LA every once in a while and see what's going on over here. I'm just going to start because, I had prepared. I thought, it's like, what am I going to talk about? Because I don't know if you know this, Thursday I'm going to show a film at LA MoCA that deals with Cuba and the work that I've done in Cuba over a long period of time. So I was like, well, let me do something, show something different here so you can see different aspects of my practice and different interests. So, as Ezequiel was saying, I want to share with you this piece that I did during COVID that was about the largest mass grave in the US. But before that, how many of you are freaking out right now? Yes. That's it? Only a few? That's pretty good. Okay, maybe some of you are too young to know to freak out, but it's time to freak out. Because we just went through a kind of earthquake political transformation. So I'm just going to, because I figure that if I didn't say anything about it at the beginning, we'd end up talking about it all the time at the end. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of things about my thoughts about the election. And I posted this morning, okay? In 2022, undocumented immigrants contributed $97 billion in taxes without receiving any direct benefits in return. Meanwhile, between 2018 and 2022, corporations like Tesla, General Motors, Amazon, T-Mobile, FedEx, Netflix, Nike, and Duke Energy earned billions in profits, yet paid no federal income taxes. So keep this in mind the next time you consider accusing immigrants of, quote unquote, living off the system. Okay? Okay. So I know that a kind of wipeout like what just happened can make some people feel kind of paralyzed with, oh my God, now what? Or just overcome with sadness or anger. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm now old enough to remember the wipeout in 1984 with Reagan and other times when these kinds of shifts have happened. So I don't want to freak out. I did feel sad, but I was like, okay, so now what to focus on? And the last 5 years or so, since the whole crisis around parent-child separation, I started volunteering as a interpreter for asylum seekers in New York, where I live, and started out working for New Sanctuary Coalition. And then that organization kind of fell apart, and then a small number of the attorneys and volunteers got together and started a smaller pro se clinic for people seeking asylum to help them with all the paperwork so that they can better defend themselves in court and when they have to meet with ICE. And then eventually joined the steering committee of that organization. And so through this experience over the last 5 years, I've really come to have a better understanding of the contemporary asylum system. I am a child of refugees. My family is a Cuban refugee family. So I grew up around people who were in a very privileged refugee position because they didn't have to explain why they were fleeing. It was automatically assumed that if they had left Cuba, it was because they were victims of persecution, so they didn't have to make a case. Everybody else has to make a case. But anyway, so I've learned a lot by listening to people's stories, and also learned a lot from the attorneys about how to navigate the system, and that has gotten me more interested in looking at the history of immigration law, and also the history of migrant detention, which is talked about a little bit now, but goes way, way back to the end of the 19th century. Basically, we have, in the last 40 years, really expanded migrant detention, as you may know. It's a hugely profitable business, both for the smugglers across the border and for the federal agencies that manage it, and most importantly for the private prison industries that are really salivating right now because they know they're about to make a fortune off of expanding migrant detention. So anyway, I was asked, right after the election results by my editor at New York Review of Books to contribute to commentary. They're publishing every day commentary by different writers. So this is what I wrote. It had to be really short, and it will be published tomorrow. I sensed that Trump would win long before election night. No revelation of wrongdoing, no racist or sexist diatribe, and no display of offensive behavior has diminished his popularity. That alone filled me with sadness, but what could I do with that emotion? Join the irate progressives who declare him a fascist and insist that all his voters are bigots? Side with the moderates who argue that the despotic convicted criminals' supporters are really good people, simply fed up with ineffectual institutions and identity politics? Democrats may well be paying the price for not offering working people a solution beyond platitudes about joy. But that doesn't explain why so many Americans believe that Trump's tax cuts for the rich, his border wall, or his tariffs will reduce inflation, increase wages, or make them safer. Something else made them believe that he would solve their problems. Trump may be unhinged, but his campaign managers are ruthless and shrewd. His team devised a frighteningly effective media blitz that relied on xenophobic messaging. Between January and September of this year, the Republican and Democratic parties and PACs spent more than $389 million on immigration advertising. Democrats accounted for only 17% of that sum. 83% of it was invested in anti-immigrant television advertising by the GOP and right-wing groups. Between September and November, so in the last 8 weeks, Republican candidates, PACs, and others spent $243 million on 450 anti-immigrant TV ads that aired mostly in battleground states with very small immigrant populations. In the last 2 months alone, right-wing anti-immigrant ads aired over 250,000 times in battleground states and were viewed over 6.5 billion times. Think about the numbers. In total, the Republicans produced over 700 immigration-related ads, while the Democrats made less than 50. Republican ads claimed that American cities were being flooded with criminals. Migrants were described as illegals, aliens, invaders, traffickers, rapists, and murderers. According to an analysis by the Washington Post, a fifth of the ads incorporated stock footage, as well as outdated images and videos, some of them dating back to Trump's first presidency. So he used the so-called chaos of his own term to attack the Democrats. These inaccuracies didn't matter. What did count was that this large-scale effort to shape public opinion galvanized support for mass deportation. The ridiculous claims about Haitians eating cats in Ohio made for many an anti-Trump roast on late-night TV. But the reality is that for months, Americans have been fed a steady diet of fear-mongering ads about immigrants. The saddest part of this for me was hearing Latin American immigrants in news interviews say that they felt okay about voting for Trump because he only wanted to deport the criminals, i.e., not them. And some of the people who said that are actually in my own family. 45% of Latinos chose Trump last week, including a sizable number of Puerto Ricans who weren't moved to reject him after the reference to their country as a floating island of garbage. And millions of residents of border towns that had supported Democrats in the past also voted for Trump. They may not be aware that during the Great Depression, when the US deported over 1 million Mexican nationals, 60% of them were American citizens. And during Operation Wetback in 1954, US citizens were also among the more than 1 million Mexicans who were deported. Maybe they're just too scared to care after watching those ads. But once he gets the mass deportations up and running, Trump's next move may be to eliminate birthright citizenship. That means that people like me, the child of an immigrant who overstayed her visa, used my American birth to obtain her residency here, and then sponsored her extended family's immigration, could end up with nowhere to go. So that's what's going to come out tomorrow. So let me go back in time a little bit. I don't know, some of the students here, I don't know how young you were during COVID, how much it, how much of a sort of earth-shattering experience it was. I know I have a son who's 19 and he was in high school and it completely ruined his high school experience. And I think I also saw that my students at Cooper were very much kind of, it was trying to learn art online was really kind of a joke. And, but also people lost family members, lost friends, were freaking out, the isolation, losing your social life, and so on and so forth. It was really, an incredibly powerful and painful experience for many, many people. And it surprises me that now it's only been 4 years and it seems to be entirely forgotten. And I don't know what the statistics were here in Los Angeles for death, but New York was hit very, very hard. And very early in the pandemic. And I saw things that I'll just never forget. There's sort of like confrontations between workers at supermarkets and yuppies who were like banging, trying to get in, and the workers were trying to control the flow of people to protect themselves from contagion, and and ended up winning a lot of battles, even though a lot of like Amazon workers and other service workers were, hit very hard by the disease and often lost their jobs if they got sick. But there were battles that ended up, there still are kind of plastic dividers at a lot of the supermarkets that I go to in New York to keep the clients away from the people working as a result of COVID. But anyway, in the beginning of this, I don't know what it was like here, but we were all in New York. If you weren't a service worker who was forced to go to work, you had to either not work or work from home, right? And I was one of the people who had to work from home. So I was home all the time and, stuck without access to the normal social activities that one would engage in. So that meant that, I was on screen just, 12 hours a day or more. And I did not want to spend all my time like worrying about whether or not I was going to die, because I was pretty sure that I was not going to be one of the casualties. I did not have a health condition that would make me particularly vulnerable. I had a very good health insurance policy. I didn't have to take public transportation and go to work every day, so on and so forth. So I just thought, this is like kind of stupid for me to worry about myself, but I do want to think about something in relationship to what's happening. And so I started to do research online about the history of how artists have represented epidemics, plagues, and other diseases that have resulted in tremendous loss of life, and going back in time. And so every day I would post an example on social media, and then friends would respond, and a lot of art historians started sending me examples of artworks, and we got into this very interesting conversation about how artists represent disease, illness, epidemics, contagion, and how illness is manipulated politically to misrepresent certain groups, right? Because at the end of the 19th century, a lot of epidemics were associated with immigrants and with immigration. So I started looking at this for inspiration. I had been asked to make a piece for an exhibition that was taking place in Colombia and in Spain, dedicated to the work of Maria Teresa Hincapié, who was a Colombian performance artist who was a very dear friend, who died of cancer many years ago, and this was going to be a retrospective about her. And she's was a amazingly talented performer, but her work was completely different from mine. She didn't work with text. It was all movement-based. It was very slow. She was really all about sort of ritual and rhythm, very, very committed to a practice that had absolutely no possibility of sale, right? So she was always kind of on the brink of poverty. But anyway, these two museums were doing a big show about her, and they asked me and another artist, Maria Jose Arjona, who's a dancer and choreographer who had studied with Maria Teresa, to make works in the spirit of Maria Teresa Hincapié's work. And so, you know, I had been thinking about, do I do a pilgrimage? Like, what kind of ritual? And then COVID comes and I can't go anywhere, so no more pilgrimage. So I had to think of something that I could do in New York and then figure out how I was going to be able to do anything outside my house. So anyway, I continued doing this research, and you know, plagues and disease are nothing new, and mass death as a result of disease is nothing new. I mean, I found examples in ancient Egypt, in ancient Greece. Obviously, a lot we know about the plagues in the Middle Ages, and then with the development of cities, you know, there's all sorts of diseases that have to do with water being polluted and infected, the water supply, so that's cholera, typhoid, so on and so forth. So I was looking at all sorts of literary references and artistic references and musical references and all sorts of things to get ideas. And one thing that came up that interested me was this idea of the apparitions, you know, like what you imagine, right? That so in this condition of living with fear of an invisible enemy, what do you imagine, right? And here Defoe talks about this, about others saw apparitions in the air, right? And also what interested me were the parallels between past histories of like what happens when bodies just start piling up everywhere, and what was happening around me. I mean, New York City is a bit more compact than Los Angeles. Since I couldn't go to the gym or go to dance classes or anything for exercise, I would just ride my bike around, and I would ride by trucks of dead bodies, right? The refrigerated trucks outside of hospitals. The crematoriums couldn't burn bodies fast enough. The cemeteries couldn't bury the bodies fast enough. And also there were a lot of people dying who did not have relatives or friends with sufficient resources to pay for burials. I found out later that 7,000 dead Mexicans were eventually shipped back to Mexico by the Mexican consulate at the government's expense. But that, you can imagine, there were probably several thousand more that also died, some of whom probably ended up at Hart Island. The hardest hit neighborhoods in the city for death were immigrant neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn. And in those areas, the pileup of bodies was even more intense than in other parts of the city. So, you know, looking at these paintings and woodcuts and illustrations for later, and noticing, you know, certain repeated motifs of sort of the body strewn everywhere. And it didn't get that disordered in New York, even though there were, you know, piles of bodies in trucks, but in Brazil and in Ecuador and in Colombia, I saw pictures of like literally corpses just thrown in the street, right? But here you see the sort of the boxes of bodies waiting in the crematorium in Brooklyn to be buried. The impossibility, the trucks, the impossibility of contending with this presence. And, this wouldn't have been unusual in the 1600s, but what was strange in the 21st century was to find that the system for making dead bodies disappear, which is basically what we usually do here, was broken. We couldn't get rid of them fast enough. American culture doesn't deal with death very well, right? We tend to just people don't hang around funerals for very long. They don't stay at wakes for too long. If you come and sit for half an hour, that's a really long time. In other parts of the world, the rituals around death require a presence that goes on for days, not minutes, right? But we tend to not really make much of death here and just sort of make it go away as quickly as possible. And another phenomenon that I was noticing was that, there was two things were happening. There were news reports about these sorts of things, of the accumulation of bodies, but then there was also a tendency, like on the front page of the New York Times every day, to devote an enormous amount of space to the heroism of those who were saving lives. Right? And then, everybody had to come out at 7 o'clock at night and clap and clang for the heroes. And I was like, well, I don't really need to be so focused on the heroes, because what is the phenomenon that is really more, shall we say, powerful here is the accumulation of the dead. These paintings that depict plagues always have an accumulation of bodies, right? Every time period. And I was noticing that, but I also noticed that as early as, in the beginning, in the Middle Ages, the people who were assigned to pick up the corpses of the dead were convicts. And I also was collecting the different kinds of masks, because in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we didn't have those fancy masks, and so people were making their own masks, and there were all sorts of the DIY ones. The people came up with the most wild inventions that really did look like some of the masks from the bubonic plague. The convicts have to pick up the bodies, and the wealthy always flee from the epidemic, right? So in the Decameron, the famous story of, the aristocrats that go off to their fancy castle somewhere to escape the plague in the city, and they sit around and tell stories to themselves. And that's exactly what was happening in New York. The super wealthy were going to their homes, their second homes or their third homes in the Hamptons or in upstate New York, to flee from the disease in the city. And as a result, they overburdened the health systems in those areas that didn't really have infrastructure to deal with that many people. And a lot of those rich people decided to stay. New York City lost 500,000 residents during COVID, not from death, people who decided to move to upstate or to the Hamptons permanently. So, I'm seeing these parallels because the people who were carrying the bodies away during COVID were also convicts. And so at a certain point, I can't remember exactly when it was, I started to see stories about the opening of this mass grave at Hart Island. The mass grave had not been opened since the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. Basically, there were so many people dying who were unclaimed. There was no place else to put them. I didn't really know. I don't even know if I knew exactly what Hart Island was. I think I knew about an artist who had been working with people who wanted to get the status of the island changed so that you could visit, because it's run by the Department of Corrections, so you really can't go there. But I really didn't know very much about Hart Island, but I started seeing these news stories about the graves opening, and then started doing research, and I was like, that's it, I have to go there. But I couldn't get onto the island. It is run by the Department of Corrections, or it was at the time. It is close to Rikers, which is the big jail in New York, where when you're arrested before your trial, you're held there if you can't pay bail, or if you're not given the opportunity to pay bail. So it's a huge prison, and it's extremely violent, but good behavior is rewarded with the opportunity to work at Hart Island, which is right nearby. So those prisoners are brought by barge, and they tend to the graves, and they tend to the island, and then they're taken back to prison on a daily basis. The history of the island is that it's been since, well, during the Civil War, it was a place where so-called colored troops were housed. And then after that, it became this location for every unwanted population you could imagine. So juvenile delinquents, spillover from prisons, tuberculosis quarantine, other quarantine, Center for Other Quarantine Diseases, also a place for the people who are considered to be mentally ill. So at one point in the video, you see it says marked prison, right? So it's kind of like an extension of Rikers. So every possible variation on the unwanted had at one point or another been put there, in addition to the Potter's Field, in addition to the mass grave. So this idea that this was this kind of human, like almost like a landfill for human beings, just really shocked me. The other thing is that the island is only I don't even know if it's a mile long. It's relatively small, and it's very narrow. And supposedly, although the records are not very good, but supposedly over 1 million people have been buried there in the last 150 years. So for 1 million people to have been buried on an island that's only a mile long and like a quarter of a mile wide, it meant, when I kind of thought about it, to me that meant that the entire island was human remains, right, that had kind of mixed with earth. And it just seemed so macabre to me that there would be this place, a landfill made of human beings, right? One visual motif that I noticed as I was doing research was that there was this constant kind of triangular composition where the dead are on the bottom, and at the top of it there is some sort of apparition, some representation of death, often a human being or a human-like figure or a skeletal figure representing death. And it was because I kept seeing that motif repeat that I got this idea that I wanted to somehow or other make the video be from the perspective of death, right? That death is kind of hovering over us. Because I felt like during COVID that the possibility of death was hovering over me every time I took a breath, right? Because if the disease is transmitted through the air, it meant that there was no, any time I took a breath in, I might be killing myself, right? And the same with everybody else. So I thought, okay, I want to have, and that from there came the drone camera. That's how I got to shoot over the island, right? And that was also how I got away with getting into the island without having to physically be on the island, because I wasn't going to get permission from the Department of Corrections in the middle of COVID to get on there. A few photojournalists have been able to go on. But also, after I finished this, just so you know, there was a long struggle between activists that wanted access to the island and the city to change the status of the island so that it would be moved from the Department of Corrections to the Parks Department. And that has happened legally, but once that transfer was made, it was determined that the island is not safe, supposedly because of the buildings, but also it stinks. I got close enough in the boat to smell the island, and it really smells rotten. So they have to clean it up, and they have to tear down the buildings before it can become accessible to the public. So unknowingly, I ended up, documenting the place as it was, and it no longer be that way. So as I mentioned before, one thing that happens in the mid to late 19th century is that these representations of death start being associated very directly with immigration, with immigrants, right? That immigrants bring disease, immigrants are dirty, immigrants are infected, immigrants are a danger. I was like looking at those and thinking a lot about that, and I still do now. As some of you may know, because this happened over in this part of the country, that when Mexicans in the 1950s and 60s were coming in, they would be sprayed, because the assumption was that they were also infected or disease ridden. So, I thought a lot about, when I was planning what to write about this, I was thinking about the crisis management. How do you handle a situation like what happened to us where, like 1 million people died? That's a lot of people to die in a year, How do you handle that without mass panic, right? It was to try, I saw that there was a major journalistic effort to deflect attention from the death toll and to try to alleviate people's fears by focusing on the heroes, right? By giving Americans rituals to be able to, so, the whole thing of like going out and clapping every day. And in my neighborhood, which has grown more and more gentrified over the last 25 years, all the yuppies who were like me working from home would bring their bottles of wine out every afternoon and drink together and toast and then clap, 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 right? So that all of this was like crisis management. It was like, it's all okay. We've got our pods for our kids. Nothing bad's going to happen to us. Meanwhile, the bodies keep piling up. So, I'm not the only artist who was thinking about these things at the time. There were other people who had their ways of representing what was going on, either the heroism of the workers in the health system or just the attempts to create, as Rafael Lozano Hammer did, a space of mourning and ritual for people through his artwork. But I don't know if I'm ever going to forget the images of the mass graves. Nor am I going to lose that awareness of, that this was happening right near me and right around me. So I figured that there wasn't very much traffic in the East River or the Hudson River because so much business was shut down during COVID. So I figured that I could get out to Hart Island and, do something there without having to go through the whole permit procedure, which would have been impossible. And drone cameras are not legal in New York City. So I had to strategize with the friends who were helping me with the project about how to do it. On my first location scouting trip, I went to City Island, which is right next to Hart Island, and talked to guys who have charter boats out there, and most of them are like retired cops and firemen and stuff. And they're like, well, we don't want to take you to the side that I wanted to go to. We'll just take you to the front side where the barge was. Oh, that wasn't interesting to me. And they also didn't want to have a drone camera on them because they knew it wasn't legal. So I went, with that time that I went to talk to these guys, I was with Giandi, who shot stills for me, who's Cuban, and he's like, well, screw them. I've got a friend with a boat. Let's just wing it. So we got his friend with a big boat who came up from New Jersey, where he was docked, and brought, we had to tug the little dinghy boat along till we got to the island. And well, there we go. And So go back. Well, anyway, let me finish talking and then I can deal with this. There were maybe 2 other boats out there while we were working. So, a friend of mine had another friend who worked for NBC who had a drone camera, and he says, well, you know, you pay me $500, I'll go out there. And we figured that because there was, you know, there's not a lot of traffic, not a lot going on, that by the time we finished shooting, you know, if the cops came, they would get there too late, right? That nobody was going to report us. And so that's basically how we did it. We lowered the dinghy into the water, and the 2 camera operators were on the big boat, and they sent the drone up into the air and just followed me around and then went into the island and swerved up and down and around to get in there and to see inside what that whole space looked like, almost like as if it were, you know, a bird in flight, right? So then, you know, I brought the footage back because I couldn't really see what they were doing while I was in the boat, and then had to sit down and classify the images and then figure out how to order them and then write the essay and commission somebody to do the music for it, and that's how the whole thing came together. So that's Maria Teresa, my dear friend, and I was inspired to come up with some sort of, well, this computer doesn't like me anymore, or this thing doesn't like me anymore, but I wanted to do a ritual that was similar to the kind of rituals that she had done. And in Spain and in Latin America, to memorialize the dead on the anniversary of their deaths, you put flowers in the sea, right? So you see me in the video throwing these flowers into the water. That is basically like an offering to the people who are buried on the island, the majority of whom were probably either homeless or undocumented people who could not be identified and whose families couldn't be notified, or incarcerated people. So, I mean, Ezequiel was talking about subalterns. You know, they're the ultimate subaltern class, was buried there. So anyway, that's the story of the piece. So if you have any questions or comments or complaints, I know it's a sad story, but you know, we went through a very sad experience. And I just did this because I needed to do something, and then it turned out to be a piece that appealed to audiences that usually hate what I do, and it was included in the Whitney Biennial, and it was the only piece in the Whitney Biennial in 2022 that touched on COVID, which really surprised me, because I assumed that everybody would be as overwhelmed by the experiences of COVID as I was, but there were no other works in that biennial about COVID. So it became like this little, almost like a chapel where people could go to cry. I got so many emails and text messages from people and messages on Instagram from people I didn't even know saying that they had sat there and cried or sat there and felt really sad. So it turned out to be a kind of catalyst for reflection on something very traumatic for many people. So anyway, that's the story.